If you want to learn animation in Hitfilm, then you're in luck. Because that's what we're talking about today. Hitfilm is a powerful compositing and VFX tool that also has a fairly robust toolkit for animation and motion graphics. While not as fully featured for 2D animation as programs like Synfig, Toon Boom, or Moho, and certainly not as advanced as dedicated 3D software like Blender or 3ds Max, Hitfilm can set up the workhorse tasks like moving text and pictures, picture-in-picture effects, or complex multi-object rigs for 2D character animation, and Hitfilm Pro can handle animation of 3D models, at least for more mechanical objects, if not fully organic character animation. I'm Mike Miller with Tri-M Visual, and today we're discussing animation in Hitfilm. Animation typically refers to a series of sequential images displayed rapidly to give the viewer an illusion of motion. And animation predates motion pictures, much less digital video. Starting with Paleolithic cave art where figures would be drawn with multiple arms or legs superimposed over a torso to imply motion. Sequential art showing different frames of a single motion, similar to a comic book, goes back for thousands of years. Middle Eastern artifacts over 5,000 years old, showing multiple images showing a sequential event. Continuing on through studies by Leonardo da Vinci, his incremental sketches of how the muscles of an arm might shift as it extends. Even moving images have been around for at least 1,000 years. Chinese cultures had rotating paper lanterns with painted silhouettes that would appear to chase each other. And the magic lantern, effectively an early type of slide projector that used painted glass slides, had varied techniques used to add motion or a sense of motion to images since at least 1700 or so, if not earlier. The 19th century brought a variety of mechanical devices capable of rapidly showing sequential images, including the thaumatrope, phenakistoscope, zoetrope, kinograph, and the praxinoscope. These devices usually could only be viewed by only a few people at once and were considered to be more toys or curiosities than mass entertainment. The advent of motion picture cameras and film brought animation to a wider audience, and what we now refer to as traditional animation, hand-drawn images that would be photographed, was developed by filmmakers like J. Stewart Braxton, Emil Cole, and Winsor McCay, who all worked with hand-drawn images, either drawn directly on the film, drawn onto backlit plate, or directly onto pieces of paper. Blackton, Cole, and McCay drew each individual frame its entirety. It took producer John Randolph Bray and animator Earl Hudd to develop and patent the cell animation techniques that dominated animation for most of the 20th century. Cell animation used a painted background with foreground elements drawn and painted on translucent pieces of cellulose and overlaid over those background paintings. Stop-motion animation, in which objects are photographed, moved, and then photographed again, was also invented in the 19th century. Styles like cutout or paper doll animation blends these two techniques, with art being drawn in sections which would then be jointed together and animated via stop-motion. While today's digital animation can achieve spectacular results undreamt of in the past, at its core, digital animation is still producing a series of still frames played back rapidly in sequence to give the illusion of motion. In fact, much of the terminology and workflow in digital animation is directly taken from the techniques of traditional cell animation. In traditional cell animation, the extremes, or key poses of an action, would be drawn by the key animator. So, for a character throwing a ball, the key animator might only draw a few poses. The arms down, the throwing arm all the way back, throwing arm halfway through the motion, throwing arm releasing the ball, and throwing arm at the end of its arc. The task of filling in the rest of the frames would be handed down to an assistant animator. As an example, this study by animator Tex Avery contains 24 frames of a 49-frame sequence. The rest of the frames would have been drawn by Tex Avery's assistant. The assistant animator was often called the in-betweener. And in digital animation, the artist sets the key or extreme frames and lets the computer do the tweens. In Hitfilm, any 2D or 3D layer, any point, any mask, defined sections of 3D models, and most parameters of most of Hitfilm's effects filters and plugins can all be keyframed. To enable keyframing in Hitfilm, open up the layer controls of any selected layer or any selected effect, and look for any parameter with this gray circle icon. Any parameter with this gray circle icon can be keyframed. Clicking on the circle icon, it will turn blue, which shows that keyframing has been activated. Set a value for the selected parameter, move to another frame, change the value of that parameter, and Hitfilm will interpolate the in-between values automatically. And that's it. Animation in Hitfilm is just that simple. So I'd like to thank everyone for sitting through this very short Hitfilm tutorial. I'm Mike Miller with Tri-M Visual, and I'll see you. Okay, just kidding. Now, while animation in Hitfilm really is as simple as just turning on keyframing for a selected parameter and then changing values on different frames, Hitfilm has several other tools for controlling and refining your animation. The first of these is Hitfilm's Interpolation Curves. Interpolation curves can be changed for keyframes by using the icons located at the bottom of the viewer panel. There are several different types of built-in interpolation curves in Hitfilm, including the value graph, which we'll be discussing as its own topic. To change an interpolation curve assigned to a keyframe, twirl it open in the layer stack, click on the keyframe, and then click on the desired type from the icons. You can also control-click to select multiple keyframes, or use the selection tool to draw a box around multiple keyframes. Using the selection tool, you can even draw a box around multiple keyframes on multiple layers and change them all at the same time. A couple things I forgot to mention, which I'm going to come back and record before we move on to the next segment. Once you've turned keyframing on for a property, there's another visual guide to let you know when you're actually on a frame with a keyframe on it. When this dot appears in the center of the blue ring, your playhead is on a frame with a keyframe. See how when I move the playhead a couple frames forward, the blue dot in the center disappears. When adjusting keyframes, if you have a track active and a keyframed property active, you can easily skip forward and backward to the next or previous keyframe by using either these buttons up here or the associated keyboard shortcuts. Keyframes can also be created by hitting this button in between the two navigation icons, or if the cursor's on an existing keyframe, a keyframe can be deleted by hitting this button. So, let's move on to looking at the keyframe interpolation curves. Hitfilm's default interpolation curve is linear. With linear interpolation, the duration of the change between the two values is broken up evenly, and the interpolated values are spread evenly between the two keyframes. On screen, you can see two rotating squares and a moving crosshair underneath them. The green square is going to be our reference for the rest of this section. The red square will be changing. At the moment, both squares are set to a linear interpolation. The yellow moving crosshair below, moving up and down the yellow diagonal line in the bottom third of the screen, is actually two crosshairs composited in add mode. There is a green crosshair following the green square, and there is a red crosshair following the red square. The yellow diagonal line is actually a green diagonal line representing the green square, and there is a red diagonal line representing the red square. Since both squares are currently set to linear keyframes, these are overlapping and forming yellow. But as you can see, with linear, there is no change in speed. There's no speed up, there's no slow down, ease in, ease out. Just everything moves back and forth at a steady rate. Any changes in direction happen very abruptly. Linear interpolation is good for picking up things in the middle of the scene. Perhaps you're doing a spaceship flyby where the spaceship is already in motion. As you're following it through the scene with linear interpolation, since there's no acceleration or deceleration, the ship is just moving at speed. The smooth interpolation curve is probably the most commonly used in Hitfilm. As you can see by watching the red square, smooth interpolation starts off slowly, speeds up in the center, and then slows down again at the end. Looking at our crosshairs in the bottom third of the screen, you can see a visual representation of how smooth speeds up and slows down over the course of the motion. Remember, the red line and the red crosshair are following the red square. The green line and the green crosshair are following the green square, and the green square is set to linear. Smooth is probably the most useful overall of the built-in interpolation curves. If you've tried animating something and it's not looking right, it's looking jerky or looking abrupt, then you should probably change the default linear keyframes to smooth to give it a, well, smoother motion. Smooth is great for oscillating motions, or if you need something to slow down to a stop or speed up from a stationary position. If you've animated something and you're not happy with how it looks, the first thing you should do is just try smooth keyframes. I'll just let that bounce back and forth a couple more times because really, the best way to learn this is just to watch it. The next interpolation curve we're going to look at is called Smooth In. And with a name like Smooth In, you'd think it would start slowly and pick up speed as it goes along. And you would be wrong. As we can see from watching the red square, Smooth In is kind of the opposite of what I thought it would be based on its name. Smooth In starts off quickly and slows down as you reach the second keyframe. Smooth In is useful for that type of motion. Smooth In and the other keyframe type, Smooth Out, work well as the starts and the ends of multiple keyframe chains. Smooth In is a good one to use if you've used a couple of linear keyframes earlier in the shot and you're trying to have something slow down and stop, so you come off the linear keyframe with a Smooth In to round it off at the end. If you use a Smooth In keyframe, followed by a Smooth Out keyframe, you'll get something that will slow down, stop, and then accelerate again. Similar to that of a smooth keyframe, but at a linear speed at the far end. Again, I'll just let that bounce back and forth a couple more times. Here's the Smooth Out interpolation curve. As you can see, it's the opposite of Smooth In. It starts slowly, and then it speeds up. I really would have thought that this would start quickly and slow down at the end, given that it's called Smooth Out, but I was wrong. I don't really have anything else to say about Smooth Out, but I'm going to let this one bounce back and forth for the same amount of time that I let linear, smooth, and smooth in do. So while I'm killing some time, I'll just note that Smooth In and Smooth Out are a couple of those rare occasions where Hitfilm does something a little bit funky with its naming scheme. Another example of this in Hitfilm is proxies.
Proxies are traditionally low-resolution files intended for temporary edits that you would replace with a final file on output, but Hitfilm's proxies are actually full-resolution files intended for final output, which makes them pre-renders. Hitfilm's proxy effect indicates proxies would be a reflection or fraction of light. But in Hitfilm, caustics is a full-on reflective refractive plane simulator that makes water. So, smooth in and smooth out got named backwards, I guess. I don't know.
So we'll just let those bounce a couple more times and
move on to our next curve.
The final interpolation curve is constant. Constant holds the value at its current position until the next keyframe is reached, at which point the value changes. Constant's great if you need something to stop and hold in position for a while and then start moving again. Constant's useful if you want sudden shifts, maybe teleports or pops in appearance. I suppose constant's useful if you're doing something like keyframing the color of a light and just want it to snap from green to red without passing through any other colors. Don't really have anything else to say about constant, and I'm not going to make you all sit and listen to another sped-up, high-pitched rant. I'm also not going to make you sit through another minute of constant. So far, we've been looking at what happens when you just have a single type of interpolation curve. Where it starts to get tricky is when you start combining interpolation curves. Two interpolation curves that are of different types that are adjacent on the timeline have an effect on each other. Right now, we're looking at what happens when we combine linear and smooth keyframes. The red square, as it moves from left to right, has a linear keyframe. When it hits the right side and turns yellow, there is a smooth keyframe. When we return to the left side of the screen and the square turns back to red, we again have a linear keyframe. As you can see from the motion of the squares, and from the way the graph is being drawn at the bottom, we're not getting anything that follows either the straight linear curve or a straight smooth curve. The keyframes are combining with each other to form a new acceleration curve. Let me turn this around so that we have the smooth when going from left to right, and the linear when going from right to left. You can see this is basically the inverse of the previous curve. Let me change this up. Now we're looking at a smooth in curve when the square is moving from left to right, and a smooth out curve when moving from right to left. Again, you can see how these different interpolations combine and interact with each other to form something that doesn't match either a straight smooth in, or a straight smooth out. Let's invert that to see smooth out when moving from left to right, and smooth in when moving from right to left. With just the base 5 types of interpolation curves, there are some 25 different combinations of interactions with just 2 different types of interpolation curves. Once we start getting into 3 points, and how a left point affects a center point affects a right point, we end up with over 130 different combinations. We are not going to go through all of those in this tutorial, because nobody wants to spend 2 hours watching a couple of squares moving back and forth across the screen. This is just something you're going to have to be aware of and experiment with when doing your own animations. Let's take a look at Hitfilm's final keyframing option, manual Béziers and the value graph. For simplicity's sake, I've removed the bottom grid, and all we're going to look at are the red and green squares. The green square is going to stay at a linear keyframe for reference. The red square we're going to adjust with the value graph. On the timeline, I have the keyframes for the red square open. You can see the position and rotation keyframes, and you can see that all of them are set to linear. I'm going to click and drag to select all the position keyframes, come up to this round icon, and convert the selected keyframes to manual Bezier. When I play that back, you can see how the motion of the square is behaving much more like a smooth keyframe by default. So how do we adjust the value graph? By coming over here to the upper right-hand portion of the timeline and clicking Display Value Graph. Now we can see a visual representation of the movement as determined by the position points. And on the left-hand side, you can see these numbers: 0, 500, 1000, -500, -1000. These numbers represent the actual, literal, numerical values that have been input in the position properties. This red line is representing the X value. This green line is representing the Y value. If we were working in 3 dimensions, the Z value would appear as a blue line. I've selected just this particular keyframe at 5 seconds, where the red square reaches the right side of the blue box. You can see these gray horizontal lines coming off the keyframe. These are the tangents of the curve, and by clicking and dragging these, I can change the shape of the curve. By dragging this up, you can see that I now have a very steep rise and then a flat line here before the curve begins to go the other way again. I'm going to go ahead to this keyframe and drag that tangent much farther down. In this case, you can see that the curve is actually falling past the value of the next keyframe. I'll leave this alone for reference. Let's play that back and pay careful attention to the first time that the red square passes back and forth across the screen. So what's going on here? Well, the red square is doing exactly what we told it to do with the graph. It's starting in its position, it's moving very quickly to the other side of the screen, and then staying there before moving to the other side. You can see with this second tangent, this green line, which represents the vertical position, is dipping. And sure enough, here comes the red square moving down. The red square is also moving completely past the confines of the blue grid. Because the red line is moving farther down, farther to the negative value, farther to the left than its actual keyframe. In short, the value graph allows you to move and modify your keyframes with much greater precision than the interpolation curves. By dragging this tangent in and dragging this tangent farther out, I can change the shape of that acceleration. Note that I don't have individual control over the horizontal and vertical key points. They are part of the same keyframe and do exist on the same frame. These two values, red and green, are linked together. However, I can grab and change the individual values if I wish. By clicking and dragging a keyframe vertically, I am literally changing its assigned value. By clicking and dragging a keyframe sideways, I am changing the frame that it's on. By clicking and dragging tangents, I tune the curve the way I want it. As you can see, the value graph gives very precise control over the values of your keyframes. So far, everything we've been looking at has involved position keyframes for a moving square. I did that because it was kind of easy to see what was happening with those squares moving back and forth. But remember, keyframing can be applied to almost any parameter of almost any effect in Hitfilm. Here I've created a black plane, and I've put a lens flare on it. I'm keyframing the intensity to move from 1 to 2 to 0.5 to 1.5 and back to 0.5 again. At the moment, all the keyframes are set to a linear interpolation type. Let's go ahead and open up our value graph again. First, let's note in the value graph that I can actually change the value and position of any keyframe, even if it's not set to manual Bezier. So I can still change the intensity of this keyframe or the timing of this keyframe. However, the keyframe is a linear keyframe and it will remain a straight line. I'm going to select all these keyframes and change them to manual Beziers. The default curve for a manual Bezier keyframe is still very close to smooth, and that gives us this. It's a nice smooth movement, but let's see what happens if we start playing around with the manual Bezier handles. As you can see, this much more chaotic curve is also giving a much more chaotic change to the intensity of the flare. The values are still changing smoothly, but a lot more dynamically. Like here at the beginning, we can see that we very quickly move up to a maximum intensity, and then have a rapid drop-off. I'm going to come back over here, turn keyframing for intensity off, set intensity back to 1, and turn on keyframing for scale instead. I've set some random values for the scale, ranging from 100 to 2500. The only problem is, the displayed range on the value graph is moving from 590 to 610. I can't actually see the full range of values I'm dealing with. Well, that's what this icon in the upper right-hand corner is. You can see it says Auto Zoom the Value Graph. When I click that, the value graph automatically resizes to show my entire range of values. I'm going to select all of these keyframes again and change them to manual Bezier. Let's see what the default smooth plays like. That's not bad, but let's play around with our tangent handles and see if we can make this a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more random seeming. Note that as I'm moving the keyframe tangent handles around, the value graph is automatically auto-scaling to keep my keyframes and tangent handles visible. And let's see what that looks like. I've tweaked the first and last keyframe so that they have the same value, just to make this a smooth loop. I'm going to go ahead and play this back one more time. But let me make a couple of quick more changes to my tangents, just because I can. So as you can see, by playing with the value graph and adjusting the tangents, I can get a very dynamic looking animation. Not only that, but rather than going smoothly through all of the existing keyframes, I can dance around them, going outside the boundaries of what the keyframes are. Learning to control the value graph will give you the ultimate control over your animations. I'm going to change these keyframes all to smooth and play that back. Let me undo that, restore my value graph. Let me set this up as a split screen and play both of those back again. The smooth keyframe version is on the left and the manual keyframe version is on the right. Once again, compare how just being able to drag those tangents in the manual Bezier value graph radically changes the look of the flare beyond anything I can do with any of the inbuilt interpolation curves. The value graph really is the most powerful way to adjust keyframed values in Hitfilm, but getting used to it's just going to require playing around and using a little bit of experimentation. Understanding keyframes in the value graph are vitally important to mastering animation in Hitfilm, but keyframes and the value graph are not the only tools that Hitfilm has to facilitate animation. But for the first time, I'm going to split a tutorial into two parts. Come back next time for part 2 of how to animate everything in Hitfilm, where we take a detailed look at points and parenting, and how to make this. I'm Mike Miller with Tri-M Visual. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.